All right, Bellator Christie, Season 7, Episode 22, Theories on Human Origins and the Human Soul, beginning in 3, 2, and 1. Coming to you from the mystic, majestic mountains of northwestern North Carolina. This is the Bellator Christie podcast, where we take Christian truth into the arena of ideas. Hello, friends. My name is Dr. Brian Chilton, and I'll be your host for the next 30 minutes to an hour that we have together as we discuss the issues that truly matter. We discuss everything from Christian apologetics to theology, biblical studies, history, and a whole lot more, philosophy. You name it, we discuss it here on the Bellator Christie podcast. Well, again, we just want to thank you for joining us today, wherever you may be. This week, still flying solo, Curtis Evelo, our co-host, he is still taking care of some a sick daughter, and so we want to continue to remember Curtis, his daughter Brittany, and entire family, and praying for a speedy recovery for Miss Brittany. And so we just hope she knows that we're all thinking about her, love her, and pray for a speedy recovery. And so we do hope she gets back on her feet very soon. We want to again thank you for joining us tonight. We've got really kind of a jam-packed podcast tonight. We're going to actually cover two episodes, two topics on one episode. Tonight we're going to talk about theories on human origins and the human soul. But before we get into the discussion tonight, I want to kind of let you know about what's coming up ahead on the Bellator Christie podcast, as we have had a little bit of a tweak in our schedule. So coming up next week, we're going to have Dr. Michelle Johnson with us, as she's going to discuss, she's going to answer the question, what is the image of God? The image of God is also known in theology circles as the Imago Dei. What is the image of God? That's going to be the topic of discussion coming up next week. Now, providing that everything is good on the home front, everything is kosher, that we're able to have this, then coming up the week after that, we hope to have our ever faithful co-host Curtis Evelo, the cowboy apologist, on with us for another edition of the Question Zone. That is, given the caveat that everything goes well with his daughter, that she feels better and he's able to do that. If not, we may have just kind of a free flowing podcast discussing some topics. We may skip that week, or we may even have a topic that was originally scheduled to be later in the season on that week. So be patient with us. We're going to kind of go with the flow and see how things roll. So that'll be coming up. That'll actually close out the month of February, and then coming up in March, we've got a little bit of a tweak in the scheduling here. We're going to have really one discussion on the issue of anthropology and transhumanism. We're going to have a panel discussion with Dr. Deanna Huff and Ryan Pauly from our good friend from California. He's got a radio show out that way and a podcast that he hosts as well. They're going to both be on with us for a panel discussion discussing anthropology and transhumanism. That should be a great show. 14th, we're not sure exactly what we're going to do with the open spot. We may move another one of the episodes in that spot and finish the season a little earlier than anticipated. But then from there, we'll talk to Dr. Leo Purser about why are we here. We will have a discussion with Dr. TJ Gentry on the institution of marriage. Quite frankly, we may see if Dr. Gentry is able, we may plug that podcast in the 14th spot. So it's a work in progress. And then in April, we're going to have a study on hamartology, the study of sin, and a few concluding episodes, questions on, and then another panel discussion on an upcoming book we have hope to publish in May, and so that will finish out season 7 of the Bellator Christi podcast. So we've got a lot of stuff still ahead, and so we hope you join us for the ride. So speaking of ride, we've got a very interesting ride that we're going to take tonight, and it could be one that's a little complicated, hopefully not, but we want to talk about two things tonight. We want to talk about theories on human origin. So we've started this new series on anthropology. Anthropology coming from two words, logos, meaning the word, but it also means the study of something, and then anthropos, which means man or humanity. So put those together, anthropology, study of humanity. We want to ask two questions. Where did we come from? And then we want to ask, what is the human soul? What constitutes a person as a Homo sapien, a human being? Those are the two questions we seek to answer tonight. So first and foremost, let's take a look at the theories on human origins. How did humanity come to exist? This is an age-old question. As we look at our lives and we recognize that we are human beings, that we have a consciousness, we have a mind, will, and emotions, and we have this thing we know as the I, the person we are, this individual that we claim to be, that we know ourselves to be. The question is, how did we get here? I mean, that's a question I've asked many. I was born in 1977, and I've often thought about, as I study history, which I love studying history, but I've often thought about the question, well, where was I? What was I before 1977? Well, I wasn't around. I didn't exist at that time. And when we think of our own mortality, we think of our own being as human beings, that can be really eye-opening to stop and consider the fact that we haven't always been here, and we won't always be on this planet. We won't always live on planet Earth. So that brings the question, before we know where we're going or what's going to happen to us, we first ask the question, where have we come from? How did we begin? And there are several different theories proposed to describe how we as human beings came about. There's what's called the evolutionary spontaneous origin, or autobiogenesis. That's one theory we'll discuss. The second theory is called panspermia. We'll talk about that. That's a very fascinating theory that's gaining a lot of attention among certain souls these days. And then finally, we see special creation, or otherwise known as feat creation. That is also a theory. And then after that, we'll move into our discussion on the human soul. So as we talk about who we are as human beings. So first of all, let's take a look at the idea of the evolutionary spontaneous origin, or the autobiogenesis. This is a theory that holds that claims that life spontaneously formed from non-living materials. So if you don't evoke a creator, then how did life come to be? Well, according to this theory, life came to be, just spontaneously came to be living materials from non-living materials, because we realize that rocks aren't sentient beings. We realize that dirt isn't a sentient being, so it is a non-living thing. So how did living things with consciousness, how did living things come from non-living things? Well, according to this theory, they just spontaneously came to exist. And this was popularized by von Helmont in 1577 to 1644. He stated that life originated autobiogenetically from non-living, decaying, and rotting material like straw, mud, and so on and so forth. He believed that this came, this many advocates would say that this came about by 3.5 billion years ago. But this isn't just original to von Helmont. There was a guy, a Greek philosopher back in 588 BC, a guy by the name of Anaximander, who proposed that air was the sole cause of life. Charles Darwin, later on in 1809 and 1882, popularized the theory of evolution in his book, The Origin of the Species. So he proposed that all life developed and came to be from, as it is today, from a process of evolution, moving from one species of animal to the other. But that start had to have come by, and of course, he didn't, to my knowledge, he didn't make any claim as to how life came to be, but the idea, the going thought was that it just sprang into existence somehow. But there are several problems with this theory, and that is that it's been shown time and time again that non-living material cannot produce living. Now, the few times where people had thought that maybe an experiment showed this to be the case, it wasn't actually that life came from a non-living thing. I think there was one experiment, if memory serves correctly, that involved maggots or some creature like that coming to be off of a rock, and many people thought, well, this rock or this dirt must have given rise to these maggots. We'll come to find out, no, they came about by an already existing animal that laid eggs and sprang into maggots and came to be that way. It wasn't that life came from non-living things. Life came from life. So to my knowledge, all attempts to show otherwise have failed, because it has been shown that living material that seemingly came from non-living materials actually sprung from already living things on a non-living surface. So every experiment, to my knowledge, has not been proved, could not prove, and has not proven that living things could spring from non-living things. Francisco Redi in 1688 actually disproved the theory. He was an Italian physician who took the flesh and cooked it so that no organisms were left alive. He placed the flesh in 3 jars. One jar was covered with parchment, one was covered with muslin, and the third was left open. The flesh, meat decayed in all the jars, and flies were attracted toward all 3 jars. He observed that the maggots developed in uncovered jars though the flies visited other jars. The flies entered only the open jar and laid eggs, which produced larvae. This confirmed that maggots arise from eggs and not from decaying meat. The Miller-Urey experiment tried to get around this. They tried to argue in this experiment that lightning first created the amino acids needed for life. However, it was later shown that the chemicals making up the prebiotic soup of the Earth's surface would not have been conducive to make amino acids from a lightning strike. In fact, it would have been something more comparable to battery acid, which is not conducive for any life to exist. Such an acid would hinder instead of hasten the development of amino acids, thus disproving the theory in the end. So it does not seem like that life could spring from non-living things. So if life could not spring from non-living things and had to spring from other living things, then the idea is, well, maybe the life that came about didn't come from this planet, but came from elsewhere in the cosmos. Well, that's where we enter the new theory called panspermia. Or otherwise, some people say, to who? Oops, sorry. Phone is trying to call Dr. Purser. So if Dr. Purser's called, I do apologize, Dr. Purser. I said panspermia and it's trying to call Dr. Purser. I apologize, Dr. Purser. I don't know what's going on with my phone here. By the way, happy day to Dr. Leo Purser. He was born on Valentine's Day, and we hope and pray that he had a wonderful birthday at that. So, anyhow, the definition panspermia is a compound word consisting of two Greek words, pan meaning all, and sperma meaning seed. Panspermia can refer to one or of two beliefs. One, that a meteorite carried life to the world and started life that way. Another more popular version of panspermia holds that sentient alien beings that evolved by naturalistic means in some other part of the cosmos brought life on Earth and implanted life, seeded life on Earth. Now, it's interesting. So, people who hold this belief wouldn't necessarily say that God created it, although some people could say that maybe God sent the meteorite to Earth and planted life that way. But more likely than not, most people, more often than not, most people who hold the idea of panspermia believe that aliens did it. It's kind of like that famous meme from Alien. What was it? What's it called? Alien, Ancient Aliens, or something like that. Where one guy says, "I'm not saying aliens did it, but aliens did it." Well, that's kind of sort of what this theory holds. It's that aliens of some sort, sentient beings from a far distant galaxy, must have been responsible for implanting life on Earth, and that's how it came to be. Again, this shows just how complicated and how puzzling the origin of life truly is. Now, who advocates this? Well, it may surprise you that famed atheist Richard Dawkins on the Ben Stein movie Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, advocated panspermia. He held that the universe had all the hallmarks, all the earmarks of being designed. He said there's no way we could get around that. But he said that it's likely that the universe was designed, or that life on Earth was designed, but it didn't come from God. It came from aliens across the cosmos that evolved in very naturalistic means. Richard Dawkins wasn't the first to think that this could be the case. In the 5th century BC, Greek naturalist Anaxagoras. This is what happens when you have a Southern boy trying to pronounce Greek words. It doesn't always come out right. Anaxagoras, he also advocated this belief that somehow life was planted some form or fashion on Earth and came to be. So advocates of both panspermia and evolutionary spontaneous origin or autobiogenesis maintain that human life came to existence by evolutionary means and just sprang into life or was seeded by some other alien life form. But there are several problems with both of these theories. First and most prominent problem is that there's no independent verification that panspermia or autobiogenesis are correct. There's no independent validation that life can spring from non-living things, and there's no independent verification that some alien life form implanted life on Earth. And with the issue with aliens, even if they do exist, you have the problem of first causation, the problem of first cause. If these alien beings implanted life on Earth, they developed and implanted life on Earth, then you have to ask the question, who created the aliens? Now, some people will say, well, couldn't you say the same thing about God? Who created God? No, you can't, because God is understood as an uncaused agent, an uncaused cause, not a self-automating being, but one who's always existed by the very nature of who God is. So God is understood as being an eternal, uncaused, self-existent entity, a self-existent being. Okay, so you have a problem with aliens. You don't have a problem with God. Something must be an uncaused eternal agent to bring forth life. Something has to be, since we know that life comes from life, And since we know that aliens, if they exist, must have an original causation to their existence, then we know that there is one ultimate cause behind all life, and that ultimate cause must be God, something, someone that is eternal, a living being that is eternal, that gives, since life comes from life, and since we have to have an eternal cause, causing agent, that only the only answer is that agent must be God. God is the only answer that works. And this brings us to the final theory, and that is special creation or fiat creation. This is the belief that God created life by a special act of creation. Humanity did not necessarily evolve from previous creatures, but human beings were a special creation of God. And this is what we mean when we say that human beings were made in the Imago Dei. The Imago Dei means the image of God. Now, what is it? What is the image of God? Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this whole concept next week with Dr. Michelle Johnson. Um, but we see that human beings are special creations. Now, does this make us boastful and proud? Are we guilty of speciesism, thinking that humanity is better than any other species by saying this? No. Here's a reason. You don't see animals of other walks building temples, building churches, mosques. You don't see though. You don't see that. Animals live by their instincts. Now, I'm not saying that animals aren't smart. Animals are very smart, especially certain dogs. My cat, we have a cat who's extremely smart. He's too smart. He's too smart for his own good. He gets into trouble a lot of times because he's so smart. But human beings have this special spiritual aspect to themselves, and we're going to talk about that in a few moments. But part of that is what makes us made in the image of God, that Imago Dei. Part of that is what makes us who we are. So, who advocates creation being a special act of God and human beings being a special act of God? Well, obviously Christians do. We find that in the New Testament, the Bible, and the Old Testament as well. Jewish individuals advocate this in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, containing, it's called Tanakh, from three consonants: T meaning Torah, the law, N from the Nevi'im, speaking of the prophets, and K of the Ketuvim, talking about the special writings. Some branches of Islam claim that human beings are a special creation of God, as found in the Quran, and most monotheistic religions advocate this as well. So, what are some reasons we have to believe that this is true? Well, number one, human beings are sentient and self-aware beings. We have a consciousness. And this brings us to the second problem. Consciousness cannot be explained away by naturalistic means. The whole issue of consciousness is something that is very complicated, and to my knowledge cannot be shown to be produced by natural things, because it has to exist independently apart from natural things. Um, because otherwise, your body recreates cells every 9 years. And if you say all your consciousness is just a part of your material body, then quite frankly, you're not the same person every 9 years. But we understand. Listen, I'm getting closer and closer to 50, getting closer and closer to 50, and I've got to tell you, I can remember what happened 9 years ago, and I know that yes, I have changed and grown spiritually, but I'm still the same person that I was 9, 10 years ago. That can't be so if consciousness is a production of the natural body. It just can't be. Consciousness exists in some sense apart from the natural body. And we see there are reasons to believe from cosmological arguments that we need to have a first cause, and the first cause must be God, must be an intelligent, powerful, loving, wise being, and we know that to describe God. Teleological arguments, talking about arguments from design, speaks to the reason for believing in the special creation of humanity. Argument from beauty, the fact that we recognize beauty and goodness in creation speaks to the special creation that we are, because otherwise we would not be able to appreciate beauty and goodness. We wouldn't know goodness without God. The design of the human body speaks of the special creation, as does the design of creation itself. We've already mentioned this, the necessity of a first cause. Something has to be eternal, and life comes from life, so life has to come from an eternal living being. We know that living being to be God. And then finally, there's this interesting there's an interesting theory called quantum entanglement that speaks of the necessity of having a cosmic observer. And it's been shown that in quantum mechanics that certain quarks, bosons, things of this nature act differently when they're being viewed from when they're not being viewed. And sometimes it requires something being viewed for it to even come into being. Now, I don't pretend to understand all there is to know about quantum mechanics. I don't pretend to know everything there is to know about quantum entanglement. But it is interesting because, according to this theory, you had to have some conscious being existing prior to the origination or the beginning of the universe for it to exist. Could it be that the reality we know is only possible if we're being observed by an eternal God? Well, could be. But again, that's beyond the scope of this podcast. I just mentioned that to say there are many reasons for believing that life came from God, that we are special creations of God, and that all of creation is a special work of God. Now, having said that, what does this mean to us regarding the whole nature of humanity and who we are as beings? Well, it means that every single life has meaning, purpose, and value. Now, there's a ridiculous argument going on online, and you know what? There have been so many opinions given about this argument. I am not even going to bother you with my opinion on it. But I will just say this: I believe that every life has meaning, purpose, and value, and I believe that every person matters because they are a special creation of God. God's desire is to seek and to save the lost. God's desire is to bring all men to himself, all people to himself, men, women, rich, poor, old, young, black, white, Arab, Jew, Russian, Mexican, fill in the blank, whatever. It's God's desire to bring people to himself. It just simply is. So, with all that being said, it means that the second great commandment has a great value in our lives because it tells us that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that means that we love each and every person that we come in contact with, because every person has value. Now, I've got to move on. I'd love to stay there, love to camp out there, but I need to move on. So this is part 2. Okay, let's take it. So we see that the human beings are a special creation of God. We see that our lives have meaning, purpose, and value, but then we have to ask the question, okay, then what is the human soul? Okay, what is the human soul? Well, there are 3 interpretations. And when we talk about the human soul, we're talking about that immaterial consciousness. We're talking about that immaterial aspect of who we are. Okay, there are 3 ways that people have viewed this. There's the monist perspective, there's the dualist perspective, and there's the tripartite perspective. Okay, 1, 2, and 3. The monist perspective holds is the belief that only the body exists and there is no soul. Monists do not believe in an afterlife, but if they do, they will hold that in the belief of a final resurrection without an intermediate state. The intermediate state's talking about that time between our death and the final resurrection. Now, there are several people who advocate this viewpoint. Seventh day Adventists, many in the Adventist movement, not all, many in the Adventist movement will maintain this belief. Those from the Amazing Facts ministry will hold this belief. Some, maybe not all, Jehovah's Witnesses hold this viewpoint. Well, there are several problems with the monistic interpretation. Now, we've hit this on previous podcasts, and if you want more of a detail concerning this conversation, then I would encourage you to go back and peruse through earlier podcasts that deal with this whole issue. You'll find many more biblical passages concerning this issue. And even go check out my book, Conversations About Heaven, Difficult Questions About Our Eternal Home, available at bookstores everywhere and available on Amazon, especially Amazon and withinstock.com. Go check it out. But I give more of a detail on this issue in the book. So there are problems. First of all, is the problem with the near-death experiences. If near-death experiences are true, and I believe they are, then this almost certainly defeats the monistic perspective. There's also the problem of consciousness, as we've mentioned. If and again, time limitations won't allow me to give a full treatment of this issue, but there have been studies that have shown that a person can tell if they're hooked up to a device and there's an electrical shock that moves their finger. They can tell whether the person can tell whether they themselves are moving their finger or whether that shock involved is moving their finger. They can tell the difference between the two. If all we are material beings without a consciousness, then we shouldn't be able to tell the difference, and people can. There's also numerous biblical teachings on the afterlife, indicating the fact that we are more than just the material beings. I think about Jesus and his teaching, where he tells at the tomb of Lazarus, he tells Mary, Martha, and the people there, those who live and believe in me will never die, and those who believe in me, if they die, will wait a minute. The one who believes in me, even though he dies, yet shall he live. But the one who lives and believes in me, he goes on to say in Greek, will not never die. That means it's an impossibility for that person to die. They're just not going to. They're not going to cease to exist. They're going to continue on with God in the afterlife prior to the final resurrection. And the final resurrection, we're going to be made and be given spiritual bodies, pneumatikosoma, spiritual bodies, and it's going to be far superior to this body that we have now. Okay, so there are monists who say that our promise is found in that future body, but even then, understand that body is going to be far superior to the body we have now. It's going to be far superior to it. So there's the monistic perspective, has problems, but then there are dualists who believe in the distinction between the soul and body. They believe that we have an immaterial aspect of our lives, that is the soul, and they would also believe that we have a material aspect of our lives, being our material portion of our bodies, of ourselves, or being the body. So immaterial part of us, that's the soul. The material part of us, that's the body. But they both exist dually in some form or fashion. So you have an immaterial soul, you have a material body. That's dualism. But there are many types of dualism. There's what's called soulism. Now, I just give you the caveat here. Some philosophers may call this something different. It may be termed by different people. But the soulist or the soulism belief is the belief that the soul could have existed before the body was born. And some versions may even accept the idea of reincarnation. So there are certain advocates of this position, including most prominently that of Plato and Socrates. Socrates and Plato held this view quite strongly. Origen of Alexandria, so people call him Origen of Alexandria, he also seemed to hold this perspective as well, that human souls existed prior to our incarnation. That means prior to our birth, that there's a soul, there's a body, that it lives somewhat independently, so to speak, that the body is kind of like a housed soul. We're kind of like a ghost in a box, if you will. So Plato, Origen of Alexandria held these views. But there's also what's called substance dualism. And this is the idea that the body and soul are comprised of two different substances and exist on two different planes. And you have some very prominent people who held this viewpoint, including Rene Descartes, Immanuel Kant, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and J.P. Moreland, modern theologian philosopher out at Biola University. So these guys held to substance dualism, and there are many other advocates of substance dualism as well. It's probably one of the more popular versions of dualism today. There's also what's called property dualism, and this is the idea that the physical brain has non-physical properties which may comprise soulish features of the brain. Okay, and this is accepted by individuals such as retired NYU philosopher and professor of law Thomas Nagel. He's the one that wrote the book Mind and Cosmos: Why Naturalism is Almost Certainly False. He's not a Christian either, and he held in that view. British philosopher Galen John Strawson also holds to property dualism, as does Saul Kripke, among many others. So this is another viewpoint of the soul. Then there's what's called hylomorphism. This is the belief that the soul forms the body to comprise the whole of humanity. The soul is created just prior to the body. There may be maybe there is some indication that the soul may be created first, and then it formulates the body thereafter. The soul is created prior to the body, after which the soul is incorruptible and immortal and can survive the death of a body. This viewpoint holds, as does substance dualism, that upon death the soul lives on even though the body has died. According to Aristotelian and Thomistic thought, a person is not a whole person, though, until the final resurrection, really more in Thomistic thought. And even then, it's because the promised hope is the restoration of the soul and the restoration of the body for that spiritual body that's to come. But even then, understand, in Thomistic thought, Thomas Aquinas strongly advocated that the soul would survive death, and it is immortal. He says it's indestructible and it's incorruptible. The soul cannot be destroyed. So, who holds this viewpoint of hylomorphism? Again, morphe meaning form, hylos meaning body. It's a form-body type of union, if you will. Aristotle was a non-Christian philosopher. He held to hylomorphism, as did Thomas Aquinas, who came from a Christian perspective. And the late, great Norman Geisler also advocated the view of hylomorphism. Now, let's also take a look at one more theory before we navigate back to see which of these theories make the most sense. Tripartitism is the belief that a person is comprised of three parts: a soul, a spirit, and a body. Now, the Christian view taken from the tripartite division comes from 1 Thessalonians 5:23, which speaks of a person existing as a soul, a body, and a spirit. According to this view, according to this view, the body is a person's physical being, the soul contains a person's mind, will, and emotions, and the spirit is what connects an individual to God. However, Norman Geisler has rightly argued in his works that the immaterial part of a person likely contains both soul and spirit. Thus, there's no need to divide the two as separate entities. It may be that our soul contains that soulish aspect and that spirit aspect, but they both exist together as an immaterial union. If a person did have soul and spirit existing separately, then we have to ask the question: which part of the spirit goes, or which part of the person goes to heaven, the soul or the spirit? And so there's no clear answer to that. Most people who hold to tripartitism would say the soul and spirit. But if the soul and spirit go together as a unified one, then why say necessarily that they exist as three separate entities? Ultimately, as Norman Geisler has argued, we must deduce that there are two aspects of a person, the soul and the body, but within the soul, we see the soulish aspect and the spirit aspect combined into one immaterial reality. Now, what are some reasons we have to believe in dualism? As we've already mentioned, the problem of consciousness is best explained by the dualist thought. Now, whichever one you hold to, whether it's property dualism, substance dualism, allomorphism, soulism, whichever one you hold to, um, they seem to answer the problem of consciousness that monism doesn't. I think we can say naturalism and monism, according to the evidence of near death experiences, even studies in consciousness and things of this nature, and even quantum mechanics, I think we have every good reason to believe that naturalism or monism, the belief that only the body exists, is most certainly false. There's an aspect of us that lives on eternally. There's an aspect of us, a part of us that survives death. There's also the problem of individuality and self identity. As we mentioned, every 40 years, the body changes on a cellular molecular level. If you say, suppose, for instance, that a person commits a crime back in 2014, it's 2024 when this podcast is airing. It's February 15th, 2024, when this podcast is being recorded and first aired. So let's suppose for a moment that a person commits a crime on February 15th of 2014. If you think that we change, that all we are is a body and nothing more, then you could not hold someone accountable for a crime they committed 10 years ago because physically they would be a completely different person. Now, you know that that is completely nonsense. I know it's complete nonsense. So we understand there must be some unifying factor in our bodies, factor in our lives that makes us who we are, and that can't be our bodies alone. It has to be something more than just our bodies. And of course, that would speak to the necessity of the human soul. There's also the problem of near-death experiences. Just the other day, never even heard this before. Not going to mention who it was, not going to mention the person she spoke of as a loved one she had. But she spoke of how this loved one had an encounter, apparently had momentarily died, and seen a loved one that they knew nothing about, and talked about the beautiful sights and about this fun activity that this young person held with this loved one that had passed as that right around the time the person was born. And the individual said there was no way this young person could have known about the person who passed. It was not a hallucination, friend. This person saw the other side. And there are countless stories of people who have seen loved ones in heaven, people who have experienced things that cannot be explained, and individuals who have seen objectively things outside their bodies that they could not have known and have been corroborated by individuals who were in that room. There's also a study that Kenneth Ring conducted that showed how 21 individuals who were blind had visual encounters after their deaths only and accurately reported things in the rooms that they could not have known about, only to return to their bodies in a blinded state. Outside their bodies, they had sight. When they returned to their bodies, they did not, because their physical eyes had malfunctioned for whatever reason many years prior. There is no way to explain these cases outside of the conscious living soul surviving death. Friend, working as a hospice chaplain, where I encounter death about every day, I can tell you I've been in hospice ministry for well, this September will be 4 years. And I can tell you this, I am more certain now that there's a heaven than I've ever been in my life. So there's the problem of consciousness. There's the problem of individuality, self identity. There's a problem of near death experiences. There's also the argument from reason, and this comes from C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, and this was I can't see. This was reported by Reppert in his book C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea. I didn't get the reference where C.S. Lewis said this, but Lewis said this. I think it's from Mere Christianity, if I'm not mistaken. I believe that's where it is. But it says the argument postulates that if, as naturalism entails, all of our thoughts are the effect of a physical cause, then we have no reason for assuming that they are also the consequent of a reasonable ground. However, knowledge is apprehended by reasoning from ground to consequent. Therefore, if naturalism were true, there would be no way of knowing it or anything else except by a fluke. So, if naturalism is true, there's no way we could ever know that it's true because there's no way we could really rationalize anything because all we are would be molecules and motions beating to the drum of our own chemicals in our brain. So, which of the views appear to be most accurate? Well, I gotta be honest. I'm kind of stuck between two positions. I personally think hylomorphism. I would before reading Thomas Aquinas, I would have said strictly substance dualism. But now that I'm reading the works of Thomas Aquinas and beginning to really understand where he's coming from, I think hylomorphism is dualism, and in many ways it resembles substance dualism to a degree. But I think hylomorphism is a good explanation because it has that mind-body connection, but it also indicates and argues that the spirit survives death. It goes on living beyond the scope of death. But I still think there are some very attractive things about substance dualism. And so I'm kind of wondering if there couldn't be a blend of substance dualism and alomorphism. Yes, I can ride the fence just as good as anyone. I'm not convinced by property dualism. I'm not. I don't really know about soulism, and I'm certainly not a monist. But I think of all the dualist notions, hylomorphism, substance dualism, those are the two kings. Those are the two kings of the party. Those are the two biggest contenders. They're in the main event. Those are the two major contenders for the championship title. Which of the two wins out? I mean, I'm kind of leaning toward hylomorphism, but I still think substance dualism has a lot to offer. So either of those two. How about that? Either substance dualism or hylomorphism, in my mind, is the best answer. But regardless of which side of the aisle you land concerning that notion, concerning that debate, just know this: your life is not an accident. Your life has meaning, purpose, and value, and you are a special creation of God. And that also indicates that God loves you with an everlasting love, that God desires to bring you into communion with himself. God desires to have a relationship with you and God has a purpose for your life. And because we understand that we're made in Imago Dei, and because we understand that we have a soul that survives death, we yesterday I attended my first Ash Wednesday service and absolutely loved it. It's the beginning of Lent. It's the beginning of this 40-day period leading to Good Friday and culminating with the greatest day of the year, Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday. Resurrection Sunday tells us that this life is not the end of the story. Our life continues beyond the scope of this mere mortal life, and that tells us that when we die, if we're in Christ, when we die, it's only, life has only just begun. It's not the end, it's just the beginning. And the resurrection of Christ proves just that. So, friends, no matter what you're going through, know that you are loved. Know that God loves you with an everlasting love. As we tell everybody, Romans 8 tells us that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Your life does have meaning. Your life does have purpose. You are of intrinsic worth because you are a special creation of God, and don't you dare let anyone convince you otherwise. Well, friends, this is Dr. Brian Chilton, and you've been listening to the Bellator Christi podcast. Next week, we're joined by Dr. Michelle Johnson as we delve in a little deeper to this topic of the Imago Dei. What is the image of God? And that's coming up next week right here on the Bellator Christi podcast. God bless. Good night.